This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. KCM Wealth Management. So a man assaults his wife or partner, and justice being what it is or isn't in Canada, he's given a conditional discharge. And one of the conditions is you mustn't go near this woman. Like that's going to work. Like the compulsive, out-of-control guy cares about that piece of paper and that judge's instructions. So the next thing you know, of course, he breaks into her house and seriously injures her by hitting her repeatedly with some sort of metal stick. Maybe he'd been missing the NHL or something. So now he's got 12 years plus and goodbye. Okay, but why did this woman have to suffer this way? Well, because justice is blind, I guess. Our guest today is Angela Marie MacDougall, who's the executive director of the Battered Women's Services Society. And Angela, you have said very clearly that the last thing on earth we need is more studies.
Well, David, most definitely. I just need to maybe just correct you. My last name is MacDougall.
Did I say MacDougall?
Yeah.
Oh,
So
forgive me. I'm so sorry. You know, last
it's
week
Scottish,
I screwed up somebody.
You know, Nova Scotia. Yeah.
Angela Marie MacDougall.
Well,
Apologies.
you know, this particular incidence of horrific violence against women and then the judgment that came from the court it was the kind of one of the catalysts for a BC consultation that our provincial government is now embarking on through the Provincial Office of Domestic Abuse and Domestic Violence, the Provincial Office of Domestic Violence. And the office is now has been going through a consultation process for the last year and has now reached out to the public and is asking for public's input into what is required, what is needed, what do people think about the issue of violence against women, or what they're calling domestic violence, and how can the government and communities take action?
So what happens at these consultations? What's a meeting like?
Well, this is an online consultation process, this one, for the public. So in the past, I mean, we've gone through, you know, we're preparing, I'm in the process of writing right now, wanting to prepare well, I guess a brief. It'll probably end up being a blog that will detail some of the last 40 years of work that women's groups and community groups have done to address violence against women. And the first consultations happened in the Lower Mainland. It was commissioned or convened by the United Way of the Lower Mainland, David, in 1978.
Yes.
And in reviewing the past, well, how many years is that? You're the calculus guy.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of years.
Yeah, that's 22, 34.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Okay, so 34 years. I have looked at probably, and this is just a quick look, probably 33 papers that give recommendations to the provincial government about how to address violence against women in the province of BC.
And of those recommendations?
Well, different things have happened over the years.
How many have been acted on?
Well, different things, you know, fortunately have happened over the years, but we've seen a certain regression in the past while. And though there's been more interest, I think, provincially because of some horrific domestic homicides, there's been more pressure put on the provincial ministries, particularly the Ministry for Children and Family Development, to address violence against women, in part because of how the system, the way that social workers, police, and the courts interact or don't respond or haven't had appropriate training or aren't taking things seriously or are not listening to each other, not sharing information. The most recent, let's say, last 5 years, This would be the third consultation that we're undergoing right now to examine the issue. It's probably going to be the mother of all consultations because it's very extensive.
But does it include face-to-face sit-downs?
It does, yeah. There's been several face-to-face sit-downs that I know that the Office of Domestic Violence, the Provincial Office of Domestic Violence has undertaken. Yeah.
What do you make of this particular incident that I quoted at the beginning, where we won't name names and cite dates, but in that kind of instance, I'm going to guess that this happens a lot, that this kind of case comes up before a local judge, and for some reason or other, the judge doesn't throw the book at the guy. He gives him some kind of a discharge and says, be a nice boy. Why do we get that? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so this is where the rubber hits the road as far as to the extent to which we think that the criminal legal system, the legal system in general, can respond.
Is it as simple as plumbing? Is because it's a male human being sitting behind the bench?
Well, you know, it has been an uphill.
That would be very simple.
Well, it has been an uphill climb to having the system, you know, the legal system, the criminal legal system, the family law system, the immigration system, the child protection system address violence against women in a way that has the woman and her experience at the center. Often the system puts itself at the center. Very system.
How do you mean?
Well, you know, I mean, if we think about this public consultation, that's part of what is happening is that it's moved the center of the problem to the system rather than centralizing it within community, within society, within the ways in which we organize.
How is it moved to the system? I mean, they're concerned with lining up their offices or their fax machines, or what are we talking about here? Rather than looking at the specifics of women being beat the hell up.
You know, we had a golden moment in British Columbia, and in the 90s, and it grew out of the Montreal massacre.
Yes.
And one of a survey, and then a study that was commissioned nationally that looked at violence against women, was a catalyst for you know, a big change within BC. One of the things that happened that was, we think, was significant and important was the creation of the Provincial Ministry of Women's Equality.
Yes.
And the Ministry of Women's Equality had the task of looking at the social inequities for women within our society and to put in services, programs, and policies that would redress that. One of the things that the provincial ministry did was to create provincial funding for services for women, and several programs started to be able to be funded because they were already happening.
Does that include your organization, Battered Women?
Battered Women Support Services, yes. We were one of the recipients of, the funding was called Stopping the Violence Funding.
Yes.
And it was for counseling services for women who were survivors of violence in relationships, childhood sexual abuse, and adult sexual assault. And that was we call it, I think of it, a golden time because it was one of the things that mattered to the policy was the redressing of social inequities. And therefore looking at the ways in which we're stratified as people and trying to find some balance there, because that's at the heart of violence against women, is the social inequities.
Yeah, I think one of the things that perhaps I'd like you to address, because I think the public, a lot of public doesn't recognize this, is that so many women do not report, and they don't report what we might laughingly call the early stages.
Right.
So first it's, oh, are you going to wear your hair that way? Oh, are you going to wear that shirt? Are you gonna, and then it's a slap, and then it's a little more, and this escalates. This kind of attack escalates in these relationships. I'm afraid most people don't know unless someone's black and blue. They don't get it.
Yes, I mean that's part of the problem in a way that we understand the issue of violence against women in relationships, is that we draw the line along physical violence, and of course we have to. I mean that makes sense that we want to pay attention to that. It matters. Most abusive relationships are not physically abusive. The vast majority of abusive relationships are emotionally abusive, and sexually abusive.
Yes, absolutely.
And that the issue is about power and control, and that, that the abuser, and because of the social, way that we're, constructed socially, the abuser tends to be male.
Yeah.
Uses.
Sometimes it's the reverse, but often
Absolutely.
Often it's male. Yeah.
Yes, and uses patterns of power and control.
Yep.
Tactics of power and control in order to maintain domination.
Here's one of the great questions
Yep.
that I'm sure you ask clients regularly. Have you noticed that the man in your life has made sure that you have no friends? Have you noticed that your relationships have shrunk and shrunk and shrunk until he has made you utterly dependent on him?
Right. So that's you, David. You are correct in highlighting one of the very first patterns of power and control that is used in an abusive relationship, and that is using isolation.
Ooh, yeah.
So controlling who she sees, where she goes, who her friends are, limiting access to her family, to work. And the point is to, create a situation where the only information she's getting is from him, which comes the next tactic of power and control, which is using emotional abuse. And that is, I like to think of emotional abuse as anything that makes you feel bad about yourself, or makes you feel like you're crazy. And so, criticizing, as you said, criticizing, and there's no end to the things that, that you could be criticized for: how you look, what you do, what you think, how you walk, who your friends are, where you work, your parents, what happened in your childhood, what happened as, last week.
All your choices.
Everything. And so then what we have then is a situation where a woman is isolated, and the only information that she's getting is that she's stupid, and that she's ugly, and that she, can't do anything. And it has a tremendous dismantling effect. And we have an extremely abusive relationship, and nobody's been hit.
And pretty soon that woman has internalized all of this garbage, and she starts to believe it.
Well, the other side of that is that there's often family or friends and, community members who are, maybe, holding her responsible for that, saying, well, what did you do? Or you should get out of it. And if she's not leaving or addressing it, then thinking, well, what am I going to do?
You invited this.
Well, it's...
You dressed provocatively, so of course you were raped.
So what happens then is that we move the problem away toward her, that she's the source of the problem, and rendering the man invisible. And that's what the system does, often, is renders the abuser invisible. And often we see, as you've said, women are more likely not to report. Our estimates is that about 10% of abuse that would fall within the criminal code is reported to authorities. 10%.
Yeah.
And women are watching. Like the case that you referred to earlier, women are watching all the time, and to see how the system is dealing with this, and abusers are watching all the time, and seeing how the system is dealing with this. And, and we'll say things to her like, nobody is going to believe you.
Yeah, and nothing will happen.
And nothing will happen.
Let's take a little break, and when we come back, I want to address the legal system. I want you to talk about the courts, because I think that's such an important key part, and I'm sure you do. All right, Angela Marie
MacDougall.
MacDougall and not McCullough. She doesn't know the McCulloughs. She's a MacDougall through and through, is our guest. And we're going to take this little breather while I try to remember my own name. And it's davidberner.com, that's the site, and give these nice people a chance to say hello. They're the folks who allow us to bring you this program here on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. Back in a minute with our real guest, MacDougall. This program has been made possible in part by the following sponsors. The Vancouver Courier newspaper. KCM Wealth Management. The Trial Lawyers Association of BC. And we're Marie MacDougall is our guest, and she is the Executive Director of Battered Women's Support Services here in BC. So let's look at the judiciary if we can. It seems to me that not only is that one of the most important elements in this scenario, but it's probably the most difficult to change.
Most definitely. I mean, if we think about the roots of Canadian, well, you know, the Canadian law and the way that the legal system operates, you know, its underpinnings are from British common law and from France, from England and from France.
Yeah.
And it is, you know, colonial and male, and it is very hierarchical and very much about status. So just that structure in and of itself is a difficult one, I think, for women.
It's very interesting that you should say that, because it was only yesterday a friend of mine and I were talking about how BC has changed or not changed. And when I first came here 50 years ago, this was a colonial outpost. In art, in theater, in literature, in social mores. Yeah.
Yes, and so, okay, so it's important for us to understand those roots, because in British law, you know, common law, women were property of their fathers and property of men, and that there was an exchange of property through marriage. And so those roots are still within our Canadian legal system. Even though we are here in the 21st century and we think that there's equality, you know, within the legal system, those roots are those roots that hasn't been kind of cleansed or examined or looked at. So what we have then is we have a system that is structured in a way that does not see women as subjects.
Yes.
And then, so when women are abused and experience violence, right off the bat, there's a sense of not necessarily seeing a victim.
What are we seeing? If this woman is not a victim, what is she?
Well,
did she speak out of turn?
Well, I mean, I think that's part of it. Is there's a sense of not believing her, and that the process unfolds. I mean, it's a very difficult process, I think. So in order to get to the court, the police have to be involved. And so that's the first step, is that law enforcement's called, they go to a place, a residence, they go to an incident, and then they have to assess it and decide if there's been, you know, what the nature of the situation is. And then if there's been, an incident that, then they make decisions about approving, recommending charges to Crown Counsel, who then makes a decision about whether there's enough evidence. And in these circumstances, often, you know, the only evidence it's up to the police to gather the evidence. They have to use their evidence-based investigation methods in order to gather the evidence. So this is all difficult because, you know, the police are coming from their own ideology, their own sense of where women and men are in relationships. And so that is often one of the first places that we have a problem, is the law enforcement not seeing a victim, not necessarily thinking that they have enough in order to recommend charges. Then we have Crown Counsel in the same situation, where because the police hasn't conducted a proper investigation, there isn't enough information for Crown to approve charges. And if it does make it to the next step, where it ends up, you know, often, you know, there's a decision that there is enough evidence, because we're talking about a very intimate situation where often the only witnesses are the woman and the man. And you got he said, she said. That's how the police frame it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then the police and the Crown Counsels have a problem, because they will often say, we don't have enough, we know this will not survive court. We know the judge will throw this out.
Yes.
So, you know, my son had someone smashing his truck a few years ago, and the police said, there's no point in making a charge out of this, even though they caught the kids. So they just got the kids to get some money out of the ATM and pay my son for the smashed truck. I mean, but my son wanted these kids to go through the process of facing a court, and the police won't do it because they know it's not going to get there.
So what we end up doing, and this is the role of groups like Battered Women's Support Services, and we're not alone, we're one of 240 organizations, groups around the province.
Wow.
Well, you know, in 2009, there were over 10,000 reported incidences of domestic violence in 2009.
Which means there were 100,000.
Lots, you know. And then if we think then, with those 10,000 incidences, there's, you know, around 700 transition house beds. Not to say that every single incident will require a transition house bed, but if we, juxtapose 10,000 to 700,
yeah.
We can see that it's it's an uphill climb for women that want to find safety. So, what we do in this instance is that we, with women's request, is we will act as advocates for her in order to navigate the legal systems, in order to put pressure on police in order to follow their own policies, in order to put pressure on Crown to approve charges, in order to document when there's been egregious failures. Now, the case that we've talked about, from our point of view, we've seen this happen often where there's been charges have been stayed, there's a protection order, which, as you've said, is a piece of paper. And we've had incidences, lots of them, where men are routinely breaching the no contact orders, and police are not following up. They're not, arresting. They're not, doing their job as far as then arresting the guy or at least giving him a talking to. They're not doing that. Yep. So we've seen this, and we've also seen many instances where there's been, charges have been stayed, or even if there's been convictions or if there's been sentencing that maybe it's probation. There was a case again in 2009 where a man, several incidences of stayed charges, drop charges, stay charges, and then when he was finally, convicted, he was given a year probation. 2 days after his probation ended, he killed her and another man in a public place, in a community.
I will never understand, I'm sorry to keep beating on the judiciary, but I will never understand in a broad range of cases why judges let people out who have shown consistently, predictably bad behavior and say, these are the conditions: you must not drink, you must not drive again. The guy who keeps driving his car dangerously, well, you must not drive again. Or the guy who uses firearms, well, you can't be near a firearm. This, drunks drink, dope fiends shoot dope. Guys who batter women. That's not going to change.
Right. I mean, often that is the case where they're looking at each incident in isolation of all the other incidences, and we've had all kinds of that. And so going back to this piece about the public consultation is, again, when I said about system-centric, that the system, just in and of itself, it cannot do it. The power and the resources need to be given to the community and, quite frankly, to the groups that are doing the frontline work with women, who we are in the best position to be, we already have our networks of support, we have our relationships with police, we have our relationships that we can do that work, and we're already doing prevention work in high schools. We can do that work as far as making a meaningful impact and really getting at the roots of why there is violence against women in relationships.
Let me ask about it's a politically incorrect question, but I know you can add about.
Are you sure?
Yeah, sure. But you spoke about colonialism, but we have a new kind of colonialism called immigration, and we have people coming from other cultures who have other mindsets, particularly the mindset that women are chattels. Okay. What are you able to do, or how do you start to wrestle with that?
Well, I mean, I wrestle with it first and foremost by saying, David, we just talked about this earlier. I talked about colonial law that saw women as property.
Yeah, right.
So this is not an issue for immigrant communities, and Canada is a country made up of immigrants.
Right.
So if we're talking about Canada, we're talking about a country made up of immigrants, unless we're Indigenous.
Right.
The only thing we have now are immigrants of color who are visible. That is the biggest difference that we're seeing. Immigrants are visible, where in previous times the visibility came more from a name or an accent.
Right.
I mean, because unless Canada was colonized by England and France, and and even the CBC, there was a time in the CBC where if you had a name that was not English or French, you could not get a job. I mean, the anti-immigrant sentiment is deep. And so this is another example of that. Violence against women is global. On February 14th, there will be 1 Billion Rising, which is, it's also the Women's Memorial March here in Vancouver. And it's 1 Billion Rising. And that is a global movement to understand how endemic and how much of an epidemic violence against women is around the world.
Everywhere.
So when people are traveling from other lands, they're also dealing with the effects of imperialism and colonialism within their communities there, and that's in part why they're coming here, because they're being displaced for different reasons where they are. And so people come with the same beliefs and values that are global. So what we have to be really cautious and careful of with your, what you said, a politically incorrect question, is looking to think that visible immigrant communities are somehow more, inherently violent against women, or see women more as chattel or more as property. That actually is a distraction from the heart of this, which is about social inequities, primarily within gender relationships.
Are you telling me that it's not part of your role to go to certain groups and talk about this cultural mindset doesn't work in Canada?
So we absolutely are working with all communities, and we have specialized support for various communities. And some of that,
now I hear you. Now I get it. Okay.
And some of that support is in languages that aren't English.
You're saying regardless of where you come from, this doesn't hold water.
Yeah, so what it looks like is it might have a particular, look within particular cultural communities or ethnic communities, or it might have take a particular frame that then is based on a lot of history. But for us, we are not, we see it across the board.
We just have a minute left, believe it or not.
Time flies.
If you had a magic wand, what would you do? Besides ending violence against women, what would you do that's practical?
Well, practical, I would be resourcing, the groups that are doing the frontline work right now in the 240 groups around the province that are doing excellent work, coordinating their services and their support and their advocacy and doing prevention work. I would put money into the communities to do their work.
www.bwss.org. Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much, Angela. That was great.
It was fun.
Wonderful, lively conversation. An important subject.
Thank you
such
for
an important
this.
subject. All right, that's it for us, folks. We're out of here. Next week, we bring you a repeat program. Rob Fleming, NDP MLA and environment critic, talks about the Enbridge issues. And the week after that, a similar subject to what we just covered today. Tim Agg, Executive Director of Plea Community Services Society, says, why are all our groups who do such great work with people who are suffering, why are we getting less and less money from the government? Thanks for being with us. See you again here soon on Shaw Community Television, Cable 4. Good night.